What would you do if one day, out of nowhere, your HOA decided that parking your own car in front of your own house was illegal, but only for some people? That's exactly what happened to me, and what started as a simple parking rule quickly spiraled into something much bigger, exposing corruption, greed, and a system designed to control instead of protect. I had lived in my neighborhood for 6 years, a quiet cul-de-sac where people kept to themselves. We weren't close, but we exchanged polite nods while collecting mail or mowing lawns. Nobody caused trouble, and that was fine by me. Then, one day, a letter arrived in my mailbox with the HOA's official stamp on the front. The message inside was short and to the point: to maintain the beauty and safety of our community, street parking will no longer be permitted. All vehicles must be parked in designated driveways or garages. Violators will face fines and potential towing. Just like that, an unspoken part of our daily lives was wiped out with no warning. At first, I didn't think much of it. I had a driveway, tight, but manageable. But not everyone was as lucky. My next-door neighbor, Mr. Henderson, an older man who'd lived in the neighborhood longer than most of us, had an old truck that wouldn't fit inside his garage. He'd parked on the street for years without issue. Now, he stood on his porch, holding the letter in his shaking hands. "Guess I'll have to sell the damn thing," he muttered when I asked him about it. I should have realized then that this wasn't just about parking, it was about control. But what really got me was what happened next. A week after the rule went into effect, I started noticing something strange. The HOA board members, the very people who enforced this new rule, weren't following it themselves. Linda, our HOA president, had her black sedan parked right in front of her house every single night. Rick, one of her board members, kept his massive SUV permanently stationed on the curb like he had diplomatic immunity. At first, I thought maybe I was misunderstanding something. Maybe they had special permits, or maybe there was some exemption I hadn't read about. So I checked the HOA guidelines again. Clear as day, street parking is prohibited for all residents. No exceptions. No special permits. Nothing. That's when I decided to test the waters. One night, I parked my car on the street, just like they did. The next morning, a bright yellow violation notice was slapped onto my windshield. Warning: you are in violation of HOA parking restrictions. Further non-compliance will result in fines. And that's when I knew, this had nothing to do with safety or aesthetics. This was about power. And people like Linda didn't like being questioned. I stared at the bright yellow violation notice for a long time, my grip tightening around the flimsy piece of paper. I had parked in the exact same spot Linda did every night. The only difference? She got away with it, and I got a warning. I could already feel the slow burn of anger creeping in, but I told myself to stay calm. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe some overzealous HOA patrol had spotted my car and didn't realize the board members were breaking their own rules. But when I knocked on Linda's door that evening, it became clear, this was no mistake. She opened the door with the kind of smile that felt rehearsed, like a politician greeting an unimportant voter. "Oh, hi there. What can I do for you?" she asked, her tone just a little too sweet. I held up the violation notice. "Hey, I got this for parking on the street. I noticed you and Rick have your cars out every night. Is there some kind of exemption I don't know about?" Her smile didn't waver, but there was something colder behind it now. "Oh, of course. Board members have temporary exceptions for HOA business," she said smoothly. "It's just a necessary measure to keep things running." I frowned. "That's not in the guidelines." She let out a small, practiced laugh. "Well, these things aren't always spelled out. We make decisions based on the best interest of the community. I'm sure you understand." I didn't. But I could tell that was the end of the conversation as far as she was concerned. She tilted her head slightly and asked, "Is this going to be a problem for you?" There it was. The thinly veiled threat. Fall in line, or you'll regret it. I held my tongue and walked away, but I knew one thing: this wasn't over. 2 days later, the fine arrived, $154, repeat violations. I hadn't parked on the street again since the warning, but that didn't matter. They weren't just enforcing the rule anymore. They were punishing me for questioning it. I refused to pay. Instead, I started talking to my neighbors. That's when I realized I wasn't the only one being targeted. Mr. Henderson had already sold his truck. He didn't want trouble, so he gave in. But others weren't so lucky. A single mother down the street had been fined twice because her babysitter had parked outside while watching her kids. Another couple, new to the neighborhood, had received a violation just days after moving in, for their guests parking in front of their house. It wasn't just about parking. It was about control. And the fines were only part of the strategy. That's when the anonymous complaints started rolling in. It began with a notice about my lawn. Apparently, it was unkempt. Which was strange, considering I mowed it every Saturday like clockwork. The next week, I got a violation for putting my trash bins out too early. Then, a warning about a noise complaint. Which was particularly interesting because I lived alone and barely played music above a whisper. When I confronted Linda about it, she barely hid her smirk. "Oh, we take all resident concerns very seriously," she said. "Unfortunately, I can't reveal who made the complaints. We have to respect privacy, you understand." I did understand. No one had complained. Linda and Rick were making the reports themselves, using fake violations to harass anyone who didn't fall in line. I had no intention of backing down, but I also knew fighting them head-on wouldn't work. They controlled the rules, the fines, and the so-called complaints. But if there was one thing I knew about people like Linda and Rick, it was this: they always left themselves a loophole. So I sat down with the HOA rulebook and read through every line. That's when I found it, the visitor exemption clause. Buried in the fine print was a rule allowing for temporary street parking for guests, as long as it didn't exceed 3 consecutive days in a given month. There was no requirement to register the vehicle. No specific definition of who counted as a visitor. It was vague, and that made it a weapon. The next night, I parked my car on the street again. This time, I left a small note on my dashboard. Visitor parking, day 1. The next morning? No fine. I did the same thing the following night. Day 2. Still nothing. On the third night, I left the note again. Visitor parking, day 3. The following morning, I found an envelope taped to my door. I knew what it was before I even opened it. Another fine. But this time, there was a handwritten note at the bottom. "Nice try. But we both know you're not a visitor. Pay the fine." They weren't even pretending to follow the rules anymore. The HOA wasn't about maintaining order. It was about maintaining power. And Linda was making it clear, I was stepping into a fight I wasn't supposed to win. I stood on my porch, gripping the fine in my hands, feeling the weight of something much bigger than just a parking violation. This wasn't just about me anymore, it wasn't even about the parking rule. It was about a group of people who had turned a neighborhood into their personal fiefdom, making up rules as they went and punishing anyone who dared to question them. The problem was, they didn't expect anyone to push back. I wasn't about to let them win. That afternoon, I started digging. The HOA's rules, finances, history, anything I could get my hands on, most of it was buried in vague legal jargon, but after a few hours, I found what I was looking for. The HOA's budget and expenditures were supposed to be public record. Technically, any homeowner had the right to request financial statements, but when I checked the HOA's website, the financial reports hadn't been updated in over 3 years. That was my first red flag. I decided to pay a visit to Marge, an older neighbor who had lived in the community for over 15 years. She was one of the few people willing to talk openly about the HOA. Over coffee in her kitchen, she leaned in and lowered her voice. "You're not the first person to question them," she said. "You're just the first one who isn't afraid to do something about it." She pulled out a folder she had kept for years, filled with old HOA notices, budget reports, and complaints that had gone ignored. She pointed to a section on community fees. "They've been increasing our HOA dues every year, but nothing actually changes," she said. "No improvements. No maintenance. Just more rules and more fines." I started looking through the records she had, comparing them to the ones I found online. Something wasn't adding up. The HOA had collected tens of thousands of dollars for community improvements, yet nothing significant had been done. The pool hadn't been renovated. The walking trails were still in disrepair. But what had been added? New signs enforcing HOA rules. More security cameras. And unexplained administrative fees that had ballooned over time. And then I saw it. Monthly payments listed under consulting services. Thousands of dollars. Paid out every month. To a company registered under Rick's name. That's when I knew. The fines weren't about keeping the neighborhood clean. They were about making money. The HOA wasn't enforcing rules, they were running a racket. The violations, the selective enforcement, the endless fees, it was all a carefully designed system to funnel money into the board members' pockets. But that wasn't the only thing they were using to control the neighborhood. Over the next few days, I started noticing how many security cameras had been installed recently. Linda had mentioned at a meeting that they were for neighborhood safety. But when I looked at where they were placed, none of them faced Linda's or Rick's houses. Instead, they were pointed at driveways, mailboxes, and front doors. I mentioned it to Marge, and she shook her head. "Linda has access to all of them," she said. "She watches the footage herself." I tested it that night. I deliberately left my trash bin an hour later than usual. The next morning, a violation notice was taped to my door, but when I requested footage of Rick's illegally parked SUV from the past week, Linda claimed the recordings had been deleted. They weren't just enforcing rules, they were spying on homeowners to find reasons to fine them. And worse, they were only watching the people who weren't part of their little circle. I was getting close to something they didn't want me to find. And I should have known they wouldn't just sit back and let me keep digging. That night, just after midnight, I woke up to the sound of a truck engine outside my house. When I pulled back my blinds, my stomach dropped. A tow truck was backing up toward my car. I threw on my shoes and ran outside. "Hey! What the hell are you doing?" The driver barely looked at me as he reached for the controls. "Got a request to tow a violation vehicle," he said. I stared at him. My car was legally parked under the visitor exemption rule. Who requested it? He pulled out a form, already signed. Linda's name was at the bottom. I pulled out my phone and started recording. "You can't tow this car," I said. "The HOA rulebook allows visitor parking for 3 days, and today is the first day. If you take this car, you're committing theft." The driver hesitated, glancing at my phone. "You can call the cops," I continued, my voice calm but firm. "Let's see what they say." A long pause. Then the driver sighed, muttered something under his breath, and got back into his truck. "Just doing what I'm paid to do," he grumbled as he drove away. The next morning, I confronted Linda. She answered the door with the same sickly sweet smile as always. "Oh, good morning. Everything okay? You tried to have my car towed last night." Her smile never wavered. "Oh, that must have been a miscommunication," she said smoothly. "Mistakes happen. I hope this won't be a problem for you." There it was again. That thinly veiled threat. They weren't just trying to find me anymore. They were trying to get rid of me, ***. But I wasn't the type to back down. If they wanted a fight, they were about to get one. I walked back to my house, adrenaline still coursing through me. Linda had officially escalated the fight. The fines were one thing. The fake violations were predictable. But trying to have my car towed in the middle of the night? That was a desperate move. It meant one thing: I was getting too close to something she didn't want me to find. I wasn't about to stop now. The next morning, I did what I should have done weeks ago. I went door to door. I talked to my neighbors, not just the ones who had already complained, but everyone. And what I found was worse than I expected. Nearly everyone had been hit with some form of retaliation. The single mother had been threatened with legal action over unpaid fines. A young couple had received a warning for excessive guests when their family visited for the weekend. Even Marge had been fined for improper mailbox decoration because she put up a seasonal wreath. And then there was the money. The so-called HOA improvements that never happened. The budget increases with no real explanation. The thousands of dollars funneled into consulting services that led straight to Rick. People were angry. They had been for years. But they had also been afraid. That was the problem with people like Linda and Rick. They knew that fear was the easiest way to control a community. Make enough examples out of people, and the rest fall in line. But what happens when people realize they aren't alone? The first real sign that things were shifting came later that evening. A group of neighbors gathered in front of my house. Some had received fines. Some had just seen enough. They wanted answers, and more than that, they wanted action. So we made a plan. The first step was exposing them. Everything I had found, the financial records, the fines, the security cameras pointed at residents instead of public areas, I put it all together in a clear, easy-to-read document. And then, late at night, we spread the truth. By morning, every single mailbox in the neighborhood had an envelope waiting inside. Inside were the records of misused funds, proof of Rick's shady contracts, a list of unfair fines, and pictures of Linda's car parked outside night after night while she fined others for the same thing. By noon, the entire neighborhood was talking. By 5 p.m., a crowd had formed outside Linda's house. At first, it wasn't a protest. Just people standing together, waiting for her to explain herself. But as more neighbors arrived, the tension thickened. Murmurs of frustration turned into outright accusations. And then, right on cue, Rick pulled into his driveway, his massive SUV parked illegally on the street. That was the breaking point. "You fine us for parking, but you do this every night?" Someone shouted. "This is fraud. You stole our money." Another voice called out. Linda stepped outside, her usual confidence flickering for the first time. She raised her hands in an attempt to calm the crowd. Now, let's not get carried away," she said with a forced chuckle. "There are a lot of misunderstandings here. Is it a misunderstanding that Rick's been paying himself with our HOA fees?" Marge cut in, holding up a printed copy of the financial records. Linda's smile cracked. "This is out of control," she said, her voice tighter now. "We need order. The HOA exists to keep this community safe and functioning. Without rules, this place will fall into chaos." But no one was listening anymore. The power she had wielded for years, the quiet, subtle authority that kept people compliant, was slipping. Then, someone brought up the one thing she had been trying to avoid. "The bylaws allow us to vote board members out, don't they?" For a brief moment, Linda's expression flickered with real fear. Because now, she knew, this wasn't just frustration anymore. This was a movement. And she was running out of time. By the next morning, the fight wasn't just brewing, it was in full motion. The petition to remove Linda and Rick from the HOA board spread faster than they could control it. People who had been silent for years were suddenly eager to sign. Homeowners who had quietly paid their unfair fines, who had been afraid of retaliation, were now angry enough to take action. And the best part? We didn't just have enough signatures to call a vote. We had enough to guarantee they wouldn't win. Linda tried everything to stop it. She sent a neighborhood-wide email warning that removing leadership would lead to unintended consequences, claiming the HOA needed strong decision-makers to maintain property values. She even tried to push the idea that new leadership would raise HOA fees, an ironic twist considering she and Rick had been the ones quietly funneling money into their own pockets for years. But the scare tactics didn't work anymore. People had seen the truth, and once you see the truth, it's impossible to unsee it. The final meeting was packed. Nearly every homeowner in the neighborhood showed up, filling every chair, standing along the walls, even spilling into the hallway. Linda sat at the front, her usual polished expression in place, but there was something different about her now. The confidence had been replaced with something else, desperation. The vote wasn't even close. When the final count was announced, Linda and Rick were removed from the board by an overwhelming majority. The moment their removal was made official, a quiet murmur of relief passed through the crowd. The reign of intimidation was over. Over the next few weeks, the newly elected HOA board immediately began undoing the damage. The ridiculous fines issued under Linda's rule were dismissed. The financial records were audited, exposing even more misused funds. Rick's fraudulent consulting fees were terminated, and homeowners finally had access to the budget that had been hidden from them for years. And the first rule to go? The street parking ban. A week later, I pulled into my driveway and saw something that felt like a small but powerful symbol of victory: Mr. Henderson's truck parked right where it had always been, on the street in front of his house. No tickets, no warnings. Just a man who had lived in his home for decades, finally able to live in peace again. As for Linda, she put her house up for sale within the month. She left quietly, without so much as a goodbye. Rick stayed, but he wasn't a board member anymore. Without his position of power, he became just another neighbor. The fines, the intimidation, the HOA dictatorship, it was all over. Looking back, it had never just been about a parking rule. It had been about who gets to make the rules, and who has to suffer under them. People like Linda and Rick thought power came from control. But real power? Real power comes from people standing together and refusing to be silenced. So tell me, have you ever felt powerless against HOA rules or a Karen in charge? Share your experiences below. Let's see who had it worse.